in this season of Lent. Pastor Carl Eric and I are leading us into a time of thought and contemplation about seeing whiteness in a racialized world. And our hope in doing this is to come to you with personal stories, experiences that we have had, to share them with you. But not that these thoughts and this concept is about us. We share our stories that they may perhaps bring to life your story within you. I invite you to stand as you are able for the reading of our gospel for this evening. Gospel reading from St. Mark, chapter 14. Peter's denial of Jesus. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you're talking about." And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed. And the servant girl, on seeing him, began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again Peter denied it. Then, after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know this man you're talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter broke down and wept. The gospel of our Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. I think of this as one of those cringe-worthy stories. It's one of those stories that when we read it or we hear it, something so obvious occurs to us that it sets off our own feelings that involve our own senses of denial. How could Peter do that? And we ask ourselves, when have I denied Christ or my faith or something important to me like this? And we usually say, I would never do that. Especially after reading Jesus' prediction of Peter's denial, we begin to wonder why Peter goes into denial mode. Can't he remember? What's his problem? Why is he so blind? Denial. Denial, it's a strange sense within each of our beings, both in our awareness and in our unawares. Denial, in ordinary English, is asserting that a statement or allegation is not true. But the same word, or the synonym abnegation, is used as a psychological defense mechanism populated by psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, in which a person is faced with a fact that is too uncomfortable to accept and rejects it instead, insisting that it's not true despite what may be overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Denial. Abnegation. Denial is a strange thing. It's something we all do at some point or participate in some unknowing way. And it's usually based in some personal fear or some form of self-protectionism. We individualize ourselves, creating a cocoon around ourselves, denying that we would be like that. A psychological defense mechanism. Peter's denial, at the outset was his psychological defense mechanism from the dangers of being associated with this Jesus who had become seen as an insurrectionist. His denial was based in fear and self-protection. But what began for Peter as protecting himself as an individual, protecting the me, soon became an eye-opening discovery of himself as the part of a larger we. Soon participating in that larger we in the public cry to crucify him. Denial. 16 years ago this April, I registered for what was called an anti-racism training workshop that was to be held on the Luther Seminary campus in St. Paul, Minnesota. And this was a training session as part of what was then called the Minnesota Coalition and Collaborative Anti-Racism Initiative. There was a limited space to this training seminar for people to be admitted, so there was an application process. And I felt that I would qualify for this workshop because I was a seminary student, soon to graduate. I would likely become a pastor someplace in Minnesota and be ordained and have a public voice. I was convinced of my qualifications as one who had worked through his prejudices that were learned as a little boy in the early 60s. I was one who no longer held any animosity toward people of color. I was one who worked to be inclusive in the business world, to include people and respect people other than like myself. I was convinced that I would be an effective worker to help dismantle racism in Minnesota because I had worked through the murky waters of racism and I was not one of them. I saw myself as set apart, an individual, unique for this important matter of fighting racism. What I've since learned is the basis for how we see ourselves, how we see our uniqueness, is necessarily based on our comparisons with others. And I realize now this was probably at work in me. You see, the concept of pretty means nothing unless I believe others are not pretty. The concept of smart means nothing unless I believe others are not smart. The concept of deserving means nothing unless I believe someone else is undeserving. But I liked my individualism because we are adapted to individualistic thinking, but unskilled at reflecting on our group memberships. I am this because I'm not that. And that becomes a psychological defense mechanism. I believed that I was a good applicant for this seminar because I was not one of those racists. I could be a worker in this new cause. Well, let's get back to April 2003. This was a 2.5-day seminar. It was a residential workshop, a training workshop, residential meaning you stayed on site, you stayed in the rooms, you didn't go anywhere. And it was an intentional time to be with 23 or 24 other people in a variety of workshop-related experiences. In one of our early small group breakout sessions, we were asked to weigh in on this question. When was your most recent interaction with your bank? And why? When was your most recent interaction with your bank, and why? Well, I was in a small group that included 2 black men, about my age, a male Native American that was a little older than me, and a white female colleague attending Luther Seminary. The focus question was up for grabs around our table. I'm usually not the one to speak first, but this one seemed pretty easy for me, so I broke the silence first. And I told about how my banker had just called me this week, telling me that mortgage interest rates were dropping, and that I could benefit by a special refinancing offer that the bank had available for preferred customers. Would I want to be a part of that? The bank wanted to rewrite some of their mortgage loans. Perhaps their examiners were telling them they needed to do this, and they were offering a reduced finance fee to a few customers. I was lucky to get the call. For a moment, I even felt good. I felt good in my privilege and about sharing my trusting relationship with my banker. But in another moment or two, I realized by opening my mouth, I had stepped into something really deep. Very deep. In my naivete, I had assumed this was a normal interaction for anybody and their banker. The looks I received around my table, I will never forget. They were a combined look of empathy for me, but also of disbelief and horror. It was a moment I'll never forget. I felt so very alone and surprised. What had I missed? What was I so blind to? Well, my table mates, I give them credit. They were very, very kind to me. They showed empathy instead of rightful indignation. The first response I heard from another person at the table was, I don't remember when I heard from my banker last. Another one said, I don't ever recall receiving a call from my banker. Another one said, I'm pretty sure my banker would never call me, especially with my best interest in mind. Back to another person, they said, I think the only interaction I've really had with my bank is when I had an overdraft, and I argued with them, and they just made me feel worse. 2 nasty letters, some fees. I never felt good about that. I was asked if I'd ever received an overdraft letter, and I said, well, yeah, it happens. I could recall 3. Well, what did you do? Well, I went in to see my banker, and they wrote off they reversed the charges, and they had covered the checks for me. They didn't bounce my checks. The questions began to rise. How are you so privileged? This would never happen to us. I could feel what I can now call my psychological defense mechanisms going into overdrive, trying to justify where I was at in this relationship with my banker and why I would be a preferred customer. I said things like, well, I've never been late on my payments. I have a really good credit rating. I think they quickly spoke up and said, we do too. Then we began to compare some of the financial basics that we all shared, and we found that we were all very much the same. We could see no reason for any preference being given to me. I tried to speak up and tell about other reasons why I might have been preferred, but they all fell short. Why was I so preferred? I don't intend to blame bankers. I know banks and banking institutions have regulations that prevent this sort of thing from happening. But as we talked about this, and my case became a case study for the whole class, which made it kind of difficult for me. But what we discovered was when objective decisions were made by rules, the playing field was level. But whenever any subjective decisions were made, when someone in power had a little bit of say as to whether it could go this way or that way, people with my color skin were preferred. It was about at that moment that I began to see that I was part of a bigger system that was giving privileges to people like me. And then I realized I was not admitted to this seminar to learn how to train others, but I was admitted to this seminar because somebody thought I might learn something about being white. Seeing myself, I began to see myself as being part of a group. No longer that individual, but now I began to see myself as part of that group that others were not a part of. Peter. For Peter, what began as denial, me protecting myself as a unique individual, became an eye-opening discovery of himself as a part of the larger we. I was just like Peter. And that we, I discovered, holds and justifies privileges that others are not offered. And perhaps I and you are part of a greater we that is as potentially dangerous as Peter's we that we continue to cringe at every time we hear the story. You see, I believe that God, in God's creative wisdom, created the human race. And I feel I cannot be a God-created human of God's race if I hold on to an identity that says, I am because others are not. For now, tonight, I confess that no matter how much I claim to not discriminate or dislike or hold prejudice, I am a part of a greater sense of we, who hold privileges because of differences we name and claim. And like Peter, I am no longer just me. I am part of a much larger we. You're holding these little red tags tonight. I hope some of these words have stirred in you some thoughts about a larger we that you may be part of that might at some point cause you to cringe. I invite you to write a few words on those tags. Perhaps some way you are participating in a larger we.